we're seeing images coming out of the Democratic National Convention, in which both inside the hall and outside of it, we've seen pro-Palestinian advocates calling simply for a ceasefire, calling simply for an end to the genocide. And it seems like what they're saying is really falling on deaf ears.
Our political leaders on both aisles are really failing to listen to Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab voices, even as discriminatory attacks, harassment, physical and verbal assaults continue against them in the United States, and the Israeli government's attacks on Palestinian civilians in Gaza continues.
Hi, so I'm joined here today by Farah Afify, the Research and Advocacy Coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CAIR. CAIR has been a prominent advocacy group in the United States of America. Farah, I'm going to get right to it. In November, America goes to the polls. Now we know that the American Muslim community in America is incredibly diverse, ethnically, linguistically, sometimes even in terms of their political leanings. So what I want to ask you is, how much of a uniting factor politically has been the genocide that we've seen perpetrated in Palestine for the last 10 months and counting now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Frankly, we have seen Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism skyrocket in the United States over the last year. Our organization released our annual civil rights report earlier this year, where we found that we received 8,061 complaints across the country in the year of 2023. Now, that includes things like employment discrimination, so employees being targeted perhaps for posting pro-Palestinian social media posts. It includes students at the K through 12 and the university level who are experiencing discrimination based on their faith or ethnicity. And it includes everyday hate crimes, hate incidents targeting Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. At the core of this issue is Israel's continued genocidal onslaught of the Palestinian people in Gaza. We have seen hospitals bombed. We have seen civilians being threatened and being targeted on video. And the Islamophobic rhetoric of our political leaders, as well as our political leaders' continued support of the Israeli government, even as they flagrantly violate human rights law, is at the core of the Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab mindset today. So I think it's really critical when we're thinking about Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in the United States that this is deeply connected to the United States government's continued support of the Israeli government, and that is why we continue to believe that a permanent ceasefire will be the only path to ensure that Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab lives are protected in the United States and across the world.
Now, when you talk about a ceasefire, I mean, we're seeing images coming out of the Democratic National Convention, in which both inside the hall and outside of it, we've seen pro-Palestinian advocates calling simply for a ceasefire, calling simply for an end to the genocide. And it seems like what they're saying is really falling on deaf ears. While on the DNC stage, families of hostages, Israeli hostages taken by Hamas, have made an appearance. We've heard their voices. We are seeing repeatedly that calls to platform Palestinian Americans to listen to the voices of Palestinian Americans, and there are many Palestinian Americans who have lost family members in this current onslaught. They haven't really been allowed to speak. So my question to you is, why does the Democratic Party establishment seems so deaf to the voices of Palestinians and pro-Palestinian advocates?
I think what's important to remember here is that our political leaders on both aisles are really failing to listen to Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab voices, even as discriminatory attacks, harassment, physical and verbal assaults continue against them in the United States, and the Israeli government's attacks on Palestinian civilians in Gaza continues. We released data just earlier, I believe in July, that found that we received in the first 6 months of 2024, so this isn't last year, this this is this year, we received 4,951 complaints. So we very much are seeing that the wave of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism is continuing on and even set to potentially surpass last year. And our political leaders seem to not take any note. We are still continuing to see them deploy Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian rhetoric, to refuse, as you said, to listen to Palestinian voices and platform Palestinian voices. I believe that at the heart of this issue, at the heart of what we are going to experience this year, is a necessary reckoning with Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in the United States in order to be able to end the onslaught against Palestinian civilians in Gaza.
So what political choices does that leave American Muslims with? Now, I know that it's not a monolith. It's not we can't say that everybody's going to vote the same way. But on the one hand, say you have the Democratic Party, which despite polling showing that large demographics supporting the Democratic Party are unequivocally in support of a ceasefire. So it's not just that Palestinian voices or Muslim voices aren't being listened to. There are peace advocates who may happen to be Jewish, Christian, of no denomination at all, also echoing the demand of Palestinians and the demand of other pro-peace advocates calling for a ceasefire. They're not listening to them either. And on the other hand, you have Trump, who's Trump. So one question that I always hear, when I'm looking at the discourse, is that so if you're gonna criticize the Democratic stance, that means you want Trump to get elected. I mean, how does one answer that?
What I can say, and what I absolutely appreciate about what you pointed out, is that across the country, we are really seeing a diverse coalition of voices, not just Muslim, Palestinian, Arab, but also Jewish, African American, a variety of diverse coalitions forming, pushing for Palestinian human rights. For example, on college campuses earlier this year, this wasn't a Muslim, Palestinian, or Arab issue, but really it was a diverse coalition of students coming together peacefully on college campuses to call on their universities, to call on the United States government to push for an active ceasefire in Gaza and to stop sending weapons to the Israeli government in order to continue abusing Palestinian human rights. And I think that that's really what's important to remember in this moment, is that we have a diverse group of people coming together, and they are standing on their principles, and they're standing for human rights, and they are standing against genocide, apartheid, and occupation. And I believe that is what we will continue to see throughout the coming year, even if and even as our political leaders might potentially ignore those calls. And I think it's really important for our political leaders to not only end the Islamophobia, to not only end the anti-Palestinian rhetoric, but to really heed what a diverse coalition of people across college campuses, across the country, and really across the world are coming together to demand.
Now, you spoke about diverse coalitions, and one thing that I've always found really interesting are the linkages or the cross support given between the Palestinian community and the Black American community, by and large. I mean, we saw, for example, even in Gaza and in Palestine, we saw posters of George Floyd. We've seen historical sympathy, coordination, and really just support between these two communities. How well has that lasted? Is that still a current ongoing thing? Because at the same time, I mean, again, now this is a social media chapter. I don't know how much one can rely on it. We see what seems to be a clear effort to drive a wedge between the Black American community and the pro-Palestinian movements. What do you think is happening there?
I think it's really important to contextualize the current moment, especially what we've seen university and college students have the bravery to do is an example of peaceful American civil disobedience. And civil disobedience has a long history in the United States, and of course includes and incorporates the African American and Black civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. And so when we're thinking about the current moment, when we're seeing, again, what has been an incredibly diverse coalition of people coming together, of students coming together, that includes Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, Jewish, African American, and other faiths, religions, and ethnicities, it is very important to remember that they are learning from and they are coming from that civil rights tradition. And I think that we, again, will continue to see that diverse coalition working together, pushing for human rights, because this isn't just about Palestinian human rights, but this is about the protection of human rights, period, in Palestine and across the world.
Do you think that these diverse coalitions, and you're absolutely right, I mean, we've seen the proof of them. How much of a voting force do you think they're going to be? I mean, is that going to be the number one voting issue for these coalitions, or is that going to be eclipsed by, say, more domestic concerns, in your opinion?
I think what we have seen, right, is that this diverse coalition has been incredibly powerful. Again, just earlier this year, we saw them come together not just on one or two college campuses, but on several, and I believe over 100 college campuses across the United States, which eventually spread across the world. Now, those encampments were brutally attacked by university administrators who were not only enabling external forces, peers, faculty members to act in a discriminatory manner against those students, again, Muslim, Palestinian, Jewish, Arab, Black students, but we're also even actively targeting them. And I think that when students and really people across the country observed that diverse coalition coming together to stand for their principles, I think that it was incredibly inspiring. I think it's incredibly inspiring to me. And I suspect, and I get this question often, I suspect that this kind of political action, that this kind of civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience, will continue on into the fall as well.
All right, so one last question. On the one hand, you have what is clearly a grassroots movement and an incredibly diverse, as you so correctly put it, movement. On the other hand, you see some incredibly entrenched lobbies, and I'm not just talking about foreign affairs and national interest lobbies, quote unquote, but AIPAC, for example. Now, AIPAC has sunk a record amount of money into these elections. I mean, I was just reading that $8.6 million was spent just to try and successfully unseat Cory Bush. Is this a sign of AIPAC's strength, or do you think that the facade is starting to chip just because they're having to spend the kind of money that they've never really had to spend before?
I think what we're seeing across the country and across university campuses, again, even as our political leaders ignore those calls or set them aside, is that there is a strong, powerful coalition, diverse coalition that is coming together and standing up for their principles, standing up for human rights and against genocide and apartheid. I believe this is a real turning point where we are not just seeing Muslim Palestinians and Arabs who are deeply connected to the issue and deeply connected to Palestinian civilians in Gaza come forward, but we're seeing people of diverse faiths, ethnicities, races recognizing that the ongoing situation in which Israel has not only occupied Palestinian land, but has continued to abuse human rights, to target Palestinian civilians, I believe that is crumbling. And I think that the more that we see voices coming forward, the more that we see students gathering together and establishing peaceful sit-ins, the more we see protests every day on the street calling for Palestinian human rights, the more that we will get closer to achieving a vision in which Israel's genocidal onslaught against Palestinian civilians will come to an end, and where we will finally see a permanent ceasefire and the advocacy for Palestinian human rights occur.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Fifi, for joining us. And yeah, it's definitely been a change, but whether it'll affect change in time to save the remaining Palestinians of Gaza, that's another question, but it certainly is a new beginning. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much.